Welcome to all of you, the over 700 students and alumni from the Clinton Global Initiative U and Howard University communities, as well as viewers from all around the world. At this time that we are mired in a great global crisis, I appreciate the Clinton Global Initiative's focus on the future. In many ways, we've redirected our collective resources to fight the pandemic, and we were certainly absolutely right to do so. We had to do whatever we could to limit the suffering from COVID-19. One of the things that we clearly have seen is that certain communities were disproportionately affected, and paying more attention to those communities, especially as we move forward, is absolutely going to be critical to our collective success. But we cannot be so fixated on the problems of the present that we neglect to plant the seeds of our future prosperity. I'm thrilled that Howard can collaborate with CGI this week to bring together and cultivate so many great future global leaders. Let's remember that our democracy is sometimes messy, but I hope you would agree that it still works. The fact that Howard University, a historically Black college and university, exists at all is somewhat remarkable. Our founding charter was signed into law on March 2nd, 1867, by the 17th President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, who happened to be an open racist. In fact, the same day that he signed Howard's charter, he vetoed the first Reconstruction bill. Despite the flaws of the president at that time, Howard's creation was proof that our democracy still worked. People who had a vision for a university that would educate freed slaves and empower Black people with knowledge and skills to participate more fully in American society and in our national economy worked with our government to give rise to the university that would educate the first Black person, the first female, and the first individual of South Asian descent to become Vice President, Kamala Harris. Throughout Howard's history, our students and alumni have good reason to distrust the system. And yet, so many of them have gone on to careers as leaders in public service because they do realize it is one of the best ways to bring about sustainable change. It is not enough to advocate for equity and justice. We have to put in the work to turn our protests into policy that transforms the lives of the people in our communities that we are most concerned about. Yes, there are certainly flaws in our system. The foundations of government are certainly far from perfect, but there's also tremendous promise, and it is the responsibility of leaders to realize that potential. We need leaders who are civically engaged and focused on social innovation. The passion of leaders trickles down to the rest of the citizenry, and the most productive societies arise when the people take ownership and responsibility for the places they live. We need leaders who can envision a better society and put into work the reality of everyone having the fullness of their experience. It starts with local community level. We need leaders who take responsibility for the needs of individual people. At Howard, we have a responsibility to care for those in Washington, D.C., especially those in the parts of our nation's capital that are majority African American and have fewer resources than other wealthier parts of the city. We have to conduct research to identify inequities and do the work to bridge the gap. We are working to provide more nutritious food access in what is effectively a food desert in Wards 7 and 8 here in DC. We work to ensure these communities had access to COVID-19 testing and now subsequent vaccines. And there's always more to do to ensure that all needs are met. In addition, we need leaders on a global level, especially in the wake of the pandemic, when we have seen how interconnected our world truly is. We have to think about working more collaboratively. We cannot just think about distributing vaccines to our own constituents and then worry about those in other communities abroad. If we don't take care of our neighbors, then we're not taking care of those in our own houses. At Howard, I've stopped asking students about their major. I'm more interested in their mission. We encourage our students to use their education to find their purpose in life and to fulfill that purpose, to develop the skills and acquire the knowledge needed to pursue it. I encourage you all to think similarly. Use the opportunity of the CGIU annual meeting to think about your purpose. What good are you trying to do, and how can you find partners among these future leaders who can help you achieve that goal? And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Mrs. Chelsea Clinton, Vice Chair of the Clinton Foundation.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Frederick, for that very warm and generous introduction to our CGIU community. And just hello, everyone. Good afternoon. If you're kind of sharing the Eastern time zone kind of with us today, for me in New York, or Dr. Frederick at Howard, or a good morning if it's much earlier where you may find yourself, and good evening. Really, I just want to first start by welcoming again and thanking all of our CGIU students for being with us today. I want to thank all of our CGIU alums who are here and have been and will continue to participate in our programming over the next few days. I again want to just really thank not only President Frederick, but everyone at Howard for making us feel so welcome. I want to thank everyone at the Clinton Foundation CGIU team for working so hard to ensure that we are still able to gather together in really meaningful ways, albeit still virtually. It's hard to believe that this is our second virtual CGIU. It's even harder to believe that we are now more than a year into the COVID-19 pandemic, that we've lost close to 3 million lives around the world, with many, many millions more sick. And certainly, kind of while the last year and a little bit has shown us how there are so many ways that leaders can fail and leadership can be insufficient to help protect public health and to protect people's lives. It also has shown us how much leadership matters, especially to help protect public health. And couldn't agree more strongly with President Frederick on kind of the recognition that leadership at every level matters. It matters in our kind of closest communities, and it certainly matters at the global level. I also really am just going to continue to carry kind of President Frederick's question of asking Howard students kind of what their mission is kind of into my own heart, because certainly at CGIU, we very much believe that it is our job, our responsibility, our privilege to help our CGIU community realize kind of your own missions. And it's just been incredibly powerful over the last year to see so many of our CGIU students step forward and to be part of solutions kind of in our communities across the world to help save people's lives from COVID-19 and to kind of make this moment kind of more bearable, less painful, more endurable for so many. And just before kind of we move into our formal programming, I do want to take a moment to share a few of those examples with all of you, because it's just further proof to me kind of why CGIU is so powerful and so important. So just a few to share. And I also just want to say, again, another thank you to Kevin Chu and everyone at our CGIU network who launched the CGIU Action Fund for COVID that provided more than $100,000 in funding to student projects to enable students to have financial resources as well as the resources of their own talents and collaborations. So just a few quick examples of some of the CGIU kind of students' actions and programs during the last year. So kind of the first CGIU alum Binching Mao, who established the East Coast Coalition for Tolerance, where he and a team of volunteers have provided COVID-19 related translating services to more than 10,000 non-native English speakers in several states across our country. They've translated everything from kind of information about testing, about kind of when should you go to the hospital, to now how do you access vaccines. They've translated materials that were only available in English into Mandarin, Japanese, Spanish, and other languages. So incredibly proud of Binching, and also was really proud to be interviewed on his podcast a few weeks ago. In Kenya, Eric Munene Mwericheu has taken hand hygiene kind of really to the next level. He has installed hand washing stations, not only on his campus in Multimedia University in Nairobi. That was his first kind of tranche of his commitment, but now hand washing stations in high traffic areas across Nairobi and increasingly across Kenya. So clearly that's not only going to help stop the spread of COVID-19, that's going to help stop the spread of other germs too. Evelyn Wong co-founded Cove Education, a community of professors and university students who've been providing services to younger students, so from kindergarten to 12th grade, whose schooling has been appended by COVID-19. We know that almost everywhere students' learning has been disrupted. Whether those disruptions, though, have been kind of on the margins or kind of really obliterating a child's ability to learn in a coherent way, kind of being able to be connected to their teacher has been so dependent on kind of where students are, kind of where they were going to school, the resources that were already available to their families, kind of the level of privilege and safety. And so just, I think, really to call out that Evelyn and the team at Cove Education has been trying to ensure that those variables were less painfully impactful, to ensure that all the students they have been working with have the chance to continue to learn and also to thrive, even in this kind of two-dimensional disrupted COVID environment. So those are just 3 examples out of so many that I could have shared today, and that I know you'll be hearing a lot more about over the coming days. I again want to just thank everyone at Howard. I want to thank again our wonderful CGIU team, and just say how excited I am for the days ahead, for all of our programming, and for kind of our first conversation of the day. And so now, as it is always my honor, I want to introduce my dad, also the 42nd President of the United States and the founding chairperson of the Clinton Foundation, President Bill Clinton.
Hello, and thanks to all of you for joining us for the CGIU 2021 annual meeting. Before we begin, I'd like to thank President Frederick and the entire Howard community for serving as our virtual host campus. Howard has a long and storied history of producing leaders across all fields with a deeply ingrained commitment to social justice and progress. From Toni Morrison to Thurgood Marshall, from my wonderful friend Vernon Jordan to Chadwick Boseman, to Vice President Kamala Harris. Howard graduates have been transforming our world for more than 150 years now. Howard students have also been an important part of CGIU since we started it back in 2007. And I'm glad our partnership has only grown deeper throughout the planning of this meeting. I'd like to thank Dana Williams, Alonda Thomas, and David Bennett for their leadership throughout the entire process, and especially Travis Randall, a former CGI staff member and Howard alum, who helped to bring the partnership together. Finally, I'd like to thank each and every one of you from the CGIU class of 2021, whether you're on campus or at home, whether across America or around the world. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're all coming together to take action on some of our most urgent challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, systemic racism, and voter disenfranchisement. I'd like to thank you for more than 400 commitments to action you've already made. And I'm grateful that in addition to fulfilling these projects, you're still looking to do more. This meeting couldn't be coming at a more important time. With the development of a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine set, finally, there's light at the end of the tunnel. If we can keep working to keep ourselves and one another safe, we will reach that light. But our goal can't simply be to return to where we were before the pandemic hit, because the truth is, too much just wasn't working then. The last year has ripped the cover off longstanding injustices within individual societies and all around the world. We've seen historically underserved and marginalized groups bear the brunt of both the human and economic impacts of COVID-19 in America and in other countries. Time after time, we've seen how the color of a person's skin still determines how they'll be treated in nearly every aspect of American life. We've seen how scapegoating and slurs have real consequences, with the alarming rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans. And all of it has shown us how fragile our democracy really is. Even before the pandemic, you were entering a world of growing inequalities and divisive tribalism, with people pulling away from those who were different from them. Seething resentments and a broken information system have empowered those who, for profit and power for themselves, are inflaming our worst instincts. In ways large and small, people the world over has been urged to see life as a dog-eat-dog, zero-sum game. In order for me to win, you have to lose. I matter more than you do. That's the message. People are dehumanized and devalued simply because of who they are. And recent events have only revealed even more starkly the reverse, how very much we need to know each other better and how much we have to learn from one another. The good news is that your generation is better equipped than anyone to take these challenges head on. You have greater access to information. You can act together faster than any generation before you. You've shown incredible strength and resilience in responding to the pandemic. You've joined together from across all racial lines and backgrounds to stand up for justice, equality, and against violence and racism. In doing so, you've given new hope to a very old fight. In this moment of both peril and promise, your generation can be the engine of profound transformation. But it's going to take hard work, determination, cooperation, innovation, and just plain old stick-to-itiveness. That's what CGIU has always been about. And that's only been more evident over the course of the last year. I believe you'll rise to the challenge and I'm looking forward to an inspiring meeting. As we get things started, I'm honored to speak to someone who has, over the past several years, provided as strong a blueprint as anyone for how to achieve real and meaningful change. No matter what you're setting out to do, you need a clear vision, a realistic plan to get there, the fortitude to stick with it, and the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. After the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, opening the door to a wide range of discriminatory voting changes like precinct closures and elimination of early voting that disproportionately affect communities of color, Stacey Abrams launched the New Georgia Project to register voters and protect voting rights. She methodically got to work, registering the very people who are being targeted by voter suppression efforts and advocating for laws making it easier, not harder, to participate in our democracy. In 2018, Stacey became the Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia, but lost the race by 55,000 votes, largely because of voter suppression, eliminating hundreds of thousands of people from the rolls. But she channeled her setback into positive change for the state of Georgia and our country, doubled down on her efforts, started her organization Fair Fight to protect voting rights in Georgia and across America. Her work resulted in a national voter protection network amid the pandemic, along with record turnout in Georgia in the 2020 election and the subsequent Senate runoffs, helping Democrats to win both the presidency and control of the Senate. Today, her work to promote free and fair elections is even more important. Since November, listen to this, since November, more than 250 bills in 43 states have been introduced to restrict voting access. It's my great honor to welcome Stacey Abrams, founder of Fair Fight, a person who stands in the way of those who would take us back. Stacey, thank you for joining us today. And you have watching here several hundred students from around America and around the world, courtesy of our sponsor, Howard University. And they all know who you are and what you've done, but I think it's important for a little background to know that you were no overnight wonder. I mean, you're sort of the resident magician in America, at least among some of us who agree with what you did in turning the state of Georgia blue in 2020 and then winning the runoff elections after that. But I think you should take just a couple moments and tell the people who are with us today how you got interested in this work and what you would say to young people about whether it's worth the time and effort and blood, sweat, and tears you put into it.
Well, Mr. President, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Like you, I am a child of the South. I was technically born in Wisconsin, a state in the north, central north of, or the Midwest. But I grew up in Mississippi, and my parents were both civil rights activists when they were teenagers. So by the time I came along, I was part of a whole history of people who'd been fighting for the right to vote, the right to have access to democracy. And as you know, Jim Crow, the system in the South that denied access to the right to vote to Black Americans, existed from the end of slavery, basically through 1965. And so my parents were teenagers in 65. My dad was actually arrested helping register Black people to vote. We tease him that my mom was doing the same work. She was just smart enough not to get caught. But I came of age knowing that the right to vote wasn't just about casting a ballot. It was the only way to tackle the poverty we lived in. My parents both worked full time, and still we barely made ends meet. We were what they called working poor. And so my parents took us with them to volunteer because they wanted us to work our hands to make people's lives better. But they also took us with them to vote because they said, individually, we can make a little bit of change, but when we vote, we make collective change. Society changes when you vote. So when I was 17, I was a student at Spelman College. I set up my first table to register my fellow students to vote. And in 1992, I got to work on my first major campaign, and that was for then Governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. And so the very first campaign I was old enough to vote in, I voted in a primary, and I worked to get people to vote in the 1992 presidential election. And I use that one not only as an example of how long I've been at this, because that was 30 years ago. I also lift it up because it is a part of who I am. I've never stopped working on the right to vote. When I was 17 and 18, I was trying to expand access, trying to make sure more people could vote. By the time I was in my 40s, I was fighting to protect the right to vote because of the harm that had been done by the Supreme Court to the Voting Rights Act, the law that basically said states couldn't hurt the right to vote in the United States. And so I say all of this to say that to answer your second question, it's worth doing this work because I've seen what happens when the right to vote is made real. When I was working on that campaign in 92, I got to see Bill Clinton become the president of the United States and start to address some of the terrible challenges, especially that we're facing poor people in the South. And in 2020 and 21, I helped elect Joe Biden and Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff. And now we have a plan, the American Rescue Plan, that will lift half of the children in poverty out of poverty. And that's because of voting. It's because when we fight for our democracy, when we do the work, not only to protect democracy, but to encourage people to participate in it, we've got to do both. You can't do one and not the other. But when we do both together, real progress does happen. It's slow. It's sometimes plodding. It sometimes feels ineffective. But I know where I could be, but for the times I voted, the times my parents voted, and I know where we are, and I am very grateful that democracy can work.
Thank you. When you were the leader of the Democrats in the Georgia House, you ran for governor and you lost by 55,000 votes, even though you got more votes than any Democrat ever had. And most of us who looked at the race are convinced that you would have won if several 100,000 voters hadn't been purged. I think you believe that too. And so what's the first thing that happened after this election? We unfortunately didn't have a particularly good night on election night in state legislatures, legislative races. And since the election, well over 200 bills have been introduced in more than 40 states to restrict the franchise again, to make it harder for people to vote. Some of them overtly targeted at African Americans, others more broadly targeted at younger voters, disabled voters, lower income voters, people of color, immigrants. So we're going to have to fight it all over again. And it makes the Supreme Court decision gutting the Voting Rights Act, Shelby County v. Holder, look all the more absurd. This used to be a bipartisan issue. George W. Bush signed the expansion of the extension of the Voting Rights Act. Most Republicans voted for it. And then they said, we're digging our own graves. We got to restrict the franchise again. And all of a sudden it became party orthodoxy. And so now you have the irony of Republicans who said in 2020 that Joe Biden did win an honest election, that voting was easier, voting was more open, but it was fair, and the votes were fairly cast and fairly counted. And we want to make it harder to vote. And now the Supreme Court is being asked to gut the other section of the Voting Rights Act. And last year, in a decision that nobody noticed really, because everybody was concerned about the presidential campaign, our Supreme Court ruled that we have a constitutional right to vote, a right to have our vote counted, a right to have our vote counted about as much as everybody else's. So you can gerrymander districts in a way that are unconstitutional. This, however, is the only constitutional right since the right of judicial review was established. In the case of Marbury versus Madison, at the dawn of the Republic. This is the only constitutional right where you have no remedy in the courts. Talk to your state legislature. They've all been gerrymandered too,
Exactly.
or many have. So what do we do now? And tell us a little about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the For the People Act and why you think it's so important.
So, Mr. President, as you very clearly laid out, the onslaught isn't new. And I want to give just a little bit of background. The United States does not have an affirmative right to vote in the Constitution. What the Constitution lays out is how voting happens. It says that the Congress gets to determine the time, place, and manner, and it delegates to each of the individual states and territories that get to participate in elections that they can administer the election. So there isn't unlike in a lot of nations, especially most democratized nations, where there's a central universe of how democracy works and then it plays out locally. Everything for most American elections, for most elections, happens at the state level. And so the federal government, like the work that was done under your administration, we have some laws that say here are things you can't do. And we have the constitutional amendments, the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote, the 19th Amendment that gave white women the right to vote, the 26th Amendment that gave young people the right to vote. And then we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which said no matter where you live, they can't create laws that block you from voting. And we're going to make sure that states that have the right to administer these elections don't try to game the system. Because under Jim Crow, that was the most recent example, you had what were called racially neutral and facially neutral rules. So Jim Crow didn't say in law for voting that Black people couldn't vote. It just created restrictions that only applied to Black people. So it should have applied to everyone, but they created exceptions so it only applied to Black voters. The reason this is important is that when you look at what's happening today, they're using the same system. You hear these very they sound logical, these logical rules like photo ID, or, we're going to limit the number of days of early voting. We're going to end voting on Saturdays and Sundays or make it uniform across the states. We're going to cut off the number of voters who can vote by mail. It applies to everyone in theory, but they've targeted these laws so that the people who are hurt by it are people of color, namely Black people in the South, Latino and Native Americans in the West, young people across the country. And the intention is to target these communities because they are the ones who are the most likely to vote in a way that is opposite of what Republicans currently want. And let's be clear, Democrats did it first. And before Democrats, the Federalists did it. So voter suppression isn't the proxy of the Republican Party alone, but they are the leaders now. And so any rules that will mitigate that harm, that will make it better, or that can make it worse, actually tend to start at the state level. And so, as you said, in response to more Black people, more Latino, more Asian American, more Native American, and more young people voting in 2020 and 2021 than in any election, the response has been 253 bills in 43 different states to restrict access to the right to vote. And they use this term of art, election integrity, but it is absolutely this code word for racial and age-based discrimination. The only way to solve the problem is either to convince Republicans in the state legislatures that they control to not be bad people, to not do bad things, but they believe it's the only way they can win elections. They don't think they can compete with their ideas, so they're just going to stop voters they don't want to see show up at the polls. And that leads to congressional action. That leads to the For the People Act, HR 1/S1, or the John Lewis Advancement Act, Voting Rights Advancement Act, HR 4. What these bills do, For the People Act, for the first time in American history, it sets a standard for how people register to vote, for the fact that everyone gets automatically registered if you're a citizen, and that if you move from place to place, you can fix it the same day. The day you go to vote, you can register to vote. It says that everyone gets to have at least 2 weeks of early voting, because our economy is not the same economy we had in 1790. People have different kinds of jobs. They can't all vote on a Tuesday. Number 3, it says that everyone can vote by mail, which in a pandemic became a really important issue. And then those laws, those rules become the rules no matter where you live. So for the first time in American history, there will be a standardization of who gets access to the right to vote. The second part, though, is how do you stop the states that have a history of seeing good laws and trying to make them worse from doing so? And that's what the Voting Rights Advancement Act does. It restores Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which said that before you could do bad things to election laws, you had to get permission from the Justice Department. And it's going to hopefully fix what we know the Supreme Court is about to break, which is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which says you can't do anything that is going to have an effect of diminishing voters of color. And what they're arguing, what the Republicans are arguing, and they said it in their presentation, that if we don't stop these communities from being able to vote, Republicans can't win elections. And so we need both H.R. 1 S1, the For the People Act, and we need the Voting Rights Advancement Act. We need both pieces because we have to make sure everyone has the same rights. And then to your point, we have to have a law that gives people a remedy to go to court to fix what they break. And what we have to remember is it's happening from Republicans right now, but anytime a party gets into power, they are loath to give that power up. And often the only way to hold on to power when demographics shift, when ideologies shift, you can either change the way you run your campaigns and the policies you promote, or you can block people from voting. And in every authoritarian or autocratic government we see today that used to be a democracy, you will find that they started their descent by limiting the voices of the minority because the minority was getting too loud.
You know, a couple of years ago, a representative of the Attorney General's office in Texas actually said in an appeal, in his defense of Texas voter restrictions, he said, absolutely, we are trying to make it harder for Black and brown people to vote. Mm-hmm. But it's not race-based. We want to make it harder because they don't vote for us. If they voted for us, we'd make it easy for them to vote. So that's the ultimate anti-democratic statement, small d. And I actually appreciated it. I wish I could meet the guy and thank him for being honest. I'm sick of all this, sort of smarmy talk about voter integrity, which doesn't have a lick of merit, and which many of them have already acknowledged about the 2020 election, that the election was honestly held and the votes were honestly counted. So I remember after the 2016 election, I talked to an African-American woman who lives not very far from me, and she and her husband they're wildly successful. They're well-educated. They make plenty of money. I said, I bet the place you live has a lot of people that voted for Trump. She said, yeah, they do. And I said, did you ever ask them why they voted for him? And she said, yeah. And I said, they were really honest. They said, you had it for 8 years. We want it back. Mm-hmm. And he said, they weren't talking about party.
Exactly.
And so I think this is the sort of thing, you see this in the ethnic and religious and cultural tensions in many of the countries represented on this telephone call. We see it in Europe. We see it in Asia. We even see it in Africa, sadly. When people don't want to ever give up their power, they make up reasons to hold on to it. Exactly. And then they have to have an information system that puts the poison into the minds and hearts of the people they're talking to so they can have a base big enough to hold on. And this last election was really reassuring and partly because the people who weren't with us showed up in big numbers too. I think the highest percentage of registered voters where I saw a study that said 87% of the registered conservative evangelical Christians and ultra white nationalists voted. And, they didn't win.
Yeah.
And they figured we can't get higher than 87%. So we better change the rules.
Yeah.
And the sad thing is that it looks like the Supreme Court is going to back them in changing the rules, or they certainly have to this point. And therefore, Congress is our only hope. Now, let me ask you this, just to explain not only to the non-Americans on our cast, but also to the people here. Since the Constitution gives the states a lot of leeway in running these elections, how far can the Congress go in telling them how to run the elections?
So there's a false dispute that's out there. So what Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution says is that Congress has essentially the ability to set the time, place, and manner of elections. It delegates that to the states to actually administer it. But by and large, for federal elections, it is the responsibility of Congress to do what they think is necessary to set the time, the place, and the manner. Now, they can't do that for a local election for a mayor or for a state legislative election. But the reality is there's not a single state that runs two parallel systems, one that's just federal and one that's just state. There's some tweaks. So, for example, Louisiana, the state of Louisiana holds most of their elections on Saturdays, except for the presidential election, because it has to be held officially on that Tuesday. But on the rest of their elections, they hold it on Saturday because the federal government lets them do it. What would happen with H.R. 1, with the For the People Act, is that there would be a baseline set where the federal government, much like the Motor Voter Act and like the act that created provisional ballots, the Help America Vote Act, it would say that as a federal matter, we are saying that the time will be that you will have at least 2 weeks of early voting. The place will be that you allow multiple people to vote on different days. And the manner will be that they can vote in person early, in person on the day of, or they can vote by mail. It is absolutely constitutional for the federal government through Congress to set that up. And that's all the For the People Act does. Now, the people pushing back against it don't like it because they like the fact that in the state of Oregon, you can vote by mail exclusively, and they do an amazing job, have the single highest voter turnout, I think, in the country. But you get to Mississippi, you can't vote by mail unless you are disabled, elderly, or you can prove that you're going to be out of town. You don't get to vote early, and you can only vote on election day otherwise. And so the fact that we have such disparate methods of voting means that the quality of your democracy differs depending on the state you live in. And here in Georgia, until we sued them and forced changes, you could vote by mail in one county and they would let you know if they saw a mistake on your envelope. But if you voted by mail in another county, they threw your vote out. So we sued them so that everyone got to be treated the same way. And that's why the federal action is so important. When the federal government says you have to vote this way, almost every state is going to vote using those rules for federal elections, but they're not going to change it for local and state elections because they can't afford to. Running two separate systems is incredibly expensive. And so not only as a matter of law, but as a matter of practicality, Congress taking action will create a safe baseline for elections for everyone in the United States who's eligible to vote.
Now, we know that Congress is pretty closely divided in the House and 50-50 in the Senate. And the two of the Democratic senators have said they won't vote to abolish the filibuster altogether, which requires 60 votes to cut off debate on everything except the fundamental budget. Do you believe that we should say right now that when it comes to holding elections and who can vote and how, that's just as fundamental as the budget to our democracy, and that there should also be a carve out for that? Do you believe that we can we justify without, if it comes to that, let's say we got 2 senators that won't repeal the filibuster altogether, can we justify saying we got to protect our democracy here? You got 240 something examples you just cited, or 50 or however many there are, who of we don't like the way this came out, and the only way we can win again is to restrict the franchise. So we know that is a mortal blow to democracy. We know, in my opinion, that Supreme Court decision on redistricting was a blow to democracy.
Mm-hmm.
In this one case, our job is to preserve the basic building blocks of democracy. Now, that means, of course, that, you know, all this could be repealed if we ever have a Republican president and a Republican Congress. But I think it's hard to do. Then you lose, you know, that there's no pretext for it. I mean, because we're running honest elections and we need to proceed. So say a little about that. Do you favor a specific exemption for election-related voting on the grounds that it's the building blocks of democracy, and you shouldn't use a procedural vote to destroy it?
Absolutely. So let's start with this. Number one, the filibuster is not in the Constitution. It is a rule that has been exacerbated over time, but it was a rule that was designed to encourage debate. It was designed to encourage the minority to have a voice and not be overshadowed by the majority. But over time, it became a procedural tool used to stop any bills that people didn't like. And the problem there is that when you do so, you not only shut down debate, you often shut down action against perfidy and bad behavior. There are 3 exemptions that exist right now to the filibuster. The budget reconciliation one. So essentially, if it's needed to fund the government and make the government work, you can get around the filibuster. The second is for judicial appointments. If you look at Article 3 of the Constitution, we have to have judges. Congress has the responsibility to confirm the judicial appointments of the president. So they said, okay, we're going to carve that one out. That won't be subject to filibuster. The third is cabinet appointments. They were blocking cabinet appointments, and it's the obligation of the president, which is Article 2 of the Constitution, to have a cabinet to help him do, or her eventually do, their work. And they carved out an exception for that. So I'm saying if you've got to carve out for Article 3, you've got to carve out for Article 2. Article 1, Section 4 also is an example of a carve out, because it is exclusively the responsibility of Congress to decide if the time, place, and manner of elections is meeting our obligations. And right now it's not. Therefore, we should absolutely carve it out. I don't want to have the debate about the larger issue of the filibuster, because if we don't get this part done, if we don't solve the democracy crisis, the rest of it is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what else they block, because most of the Americans who are trying to be heard won't have a voice in the process at all. And so it is not only, I think, an existential crisis that we face, it is a moral imperative that we not allow a procedural rule to destroy the most durable democracy the world has known.
Let me follow up with a couple of practical things and ask you to comment on them. First of all, thank you. That's as fine a succinct statement as I've heard on the subject. There is no example in the world of a truly successful society where there is real upward mobility and shared prosperity without shared responsibilities of citizenship and a shared sense of community. And one of the reasons I think this has all happened, well, you know, all this started basically when President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And then the reaction set in. And by 1980, President Reagan was elected saying government is the problem, announcing in Philadelphia, Mississippi. I liked Reagan personally. It broke my heart when he did that. I mean, it was a terrible thing to do. And, but it made the point. They made the point what was going on here. And ever since then, I spent 8 long years trying to restore the legitimacy of the federal government in the minds of a majority of the American people. And when I left, it was the highest it had been in 30 years, but it's not sustainable under these relentless attacks. So my question to you is, what do we do to win the information war? And how do we can't avoid the pitfalls of the social media, but we have to overcome it with the promise. How are we going to do this? What's your strategy for making people continuously believe this matters? Because let's be honest, one of the reasons we're in the fix we're in is that we passed up on too many midterm elections over the last 20 years when only the Republicans were voting practically, and they like that just fine. And so now you've got state government in many states way to the right of where people are. So what's your take on that? How are we going to, how do we keep the debate going?
So I would say 3 very quick things. One, we have to be very clear with people that voting is not magic, it is medicine. Magic makes things happen, makes things disappear. Medicine helps make things better. And when you don't take your medicine, things get worse. In a democratic society, when you are silent, then you are refusing to take your medicine, and the disease that you're fighting, whether it's a disease of racism, poverty, injustice, whatever the disease is that you think matters, if you are silent, the disease gets worse. So that's first. Second, we have to connect the dots. We unfortunately have seen not only 40 years of denigration of government, we've also seen 40 years of disinformation. People don't know who does what. And we've got so many layers of government and so many jobs. One of the most important responsibilities is getting back to the basics, explaining that if you care about criminal justice reform, you need to watch what the mayor is doing. If you care about housing, look at your county zoning laws. If you care about abortion, about reproductive choice, if you care about the environment, make certain you know who your state legislators are. Not everything happens at the federal government. In fact, most things happen at the state and local level. So that's number 2. And then number 3 is stop trying to proselytize and convert someone's ideology. I start with the people who've never had anyone speak to them. And I would say this is true about your campaign for president, the work that President Obama did. What we are seeing happen now, when we go to people who've been left out of the narrative and we actually talk to them by saying not just that we understand, but we listen. When you go to the people who are left out of the conversation, you expand the pool of opportunity for change. And the work we do here in Georgia, the work we've tried to do around the country through Fair Fight and Fair Count, is by talking to people who are so often ignored or silenced. Because when someone finds their voice, it is a rare occasion that they shut up ever again. And so if we do that work, voting is medicine, not magic, that we have to connect the dots to who does what, and that we talk to the people who should be heard. I think that's how we overcome disinformation, social media that is never going to tell us the whole truth, but it's also how we build the next generation of engagement and the next generation of democracy.
I agree with you with one little caveat. I think we talk about elections, who wins, who loses, as if they got 80% of the vote. And very often it's a near run thing either way. And I believe that particularly for the party of government, if you will, though we're not a party of government only, but a party that believes you have to have a good government and a good private sector, and I think a good non-governmental sector to make a good society. What we have to do is to realize that a lot of these people out in the middle will respond to performance.
Yes.
We don't have to get them all, just a few. It's like about the metal on the floor and two competing magnets. Performance is the only thing once we get in that makes our magnet stronger. So I would urge all the young people who are here not only to get involved in registering and encouraging people to vote and doing that, but also be willing to serve, because it's a performance art and you make your magnet stronger. And I think that's our chance to get through this incredibly perilous time. We can do something about the increasing inequality of incomes. We can do something about every single one of these problems, but we have to have people committed to do it and to believe it. It's easy to sell the truth, I think, if it's evident to people.
Yes.
But if you're just going on a digging expedition and they're digging in your hate and we're digging in your hope, we don't always have a bigger magnet. If we had more people like you, we'd have the most powerful magnet on earth. Thank you so much. You've been great. Any other points you want to make?
Just that you're right. This is doable. Absolutely.
We can do it. I'd like you to close by telling these young people, including those who don't come from here, who are worried about people where they don't have democracy anymore, where leaders have decided they're going to run for life. What makes you hopeful about the future in the United States and beyond?
Let's see, I think it was 1999, 2001. I made my first trip abroad. I went to Salzburg, and I was there as a fellow on youth civic engagement. This was, 30 years ago. I was in a space, or 20 years ago, I was there to talk about why young people had to be engaged, had to be candidates, had to be operatives, running campaigns, had to be activists, encouraging people, and had to be social workers in the sense of connecting people to their power. I did it because I believed then, as I believe now, that we can win. My great-great-great-grandparents were slaves in the United States. My great-great-grandparents were sharecroppers, working on other people's land, making little money, barely able to make ends meet. My great-grandparents were domestic workers. My grandparents were cooks who worked at a college their children were legally not allowed to attend because of their race. My parents, as I said, were working poor despite having college degrees, but I became the first Black woman in American history to be a nominee for governor. And as President Clinton knows, governors are powerful people who can help change the future of society. I do this work because I have seen change happen. I am not where my grandparents were. I am not where they imagined me to be yet, but I am closer than we have ever been. And my responsibility is not to bemoan what has been past, but to understand it and to do the work to make the next generation stronger and make the next story an even better story than my own.
No one says it better. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you, sir.
Bless you. Godspeed.
To you as well. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.